Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today we are going to talk about the epistemology of Buddhism. That is also called, through several generations, trying to find answers to this question. And when we study the history of Western philosophy, we find that they have gradually improved their way of thinking, and it's a gradual evolution of thought. So we can trace the various steps through which they went through this evolution of thought. And in Buddhism, we find the Buddha long before the West was really arriving at these answers to the questions. The Buddha has been speaking about this subject, and when we study the teachings of the Buddha, we find that the Buddha is very advanced in his thinking, and it is so advanced that the Buddha has come to a final solution of the problem. So it's very great to understand this. If we study the sutra called the Kalama Sutra, there we find that in the Kalama Sutra, the Buddha goes through that the steps through which the history of philosophy has been going through. That means the steps that the philosophers had to go through as they improved their way of thinking. That is being traced by the Buddha long before it happened there. So in other words, it is a natural process that people, human beings, have to go through in order to arrive at the final goal. So it's very interesting to discuss this. Now, before we discuss the history of philosophy in the West, we can go through the Kalama Sutra, where he discusses this. And we can also first start with the history of Western philosophy. So I thought we'll start with the history of Western philosophy, how they began to discover certain things about truth. The first people who spoke about truth were what are called the traditionalists. That means whatever was found in their tradition, every culture seems to have a set of beliefs. Different cultures have different beliefs. and each culture will be just blindly believing these things because it is in their sacred books like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas for the Hindus or the Tripitaka for the Buddhists. So like that, there are these different sacred texts that they read and discuss and just believe as the truth. That was the tradition. So that is called traditionalism. So when people began to think and reason out, ask questions, is it true and is it false? This kind of thinking started what is called philosophy. So they say philosophy begins with doubt. What are they doubting? The traditions. And the doubt comes as a question. Is it true or is it false? So in other words, with doubt comes the two concepts, truth and falsehood. So when we ask the question, is it idea or theory or a rational concept that is offered by a philosopher, has to be verified through experience, through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. We can verify to see whether it is true or false. So this kind of thinking led to a concept called empiricism. So these philosophers were called empirical philosophers. So empiricism is simply depending on sensory experience. And modern science really is empirical in that sense. So the scientific method is a method of verifying all ideas and concepts through experimental observation. So this is empirical. Now, what happened was, even through this method, one scientist puts forward a certain theory, and later another scientist comes and disproves that through further experimentation and thinking and using mathematical concepts. Similar thing happened when Isaac Newton, he came out. They are able to see this truth, the reality which is transcendental. So this is why we find even today a name called transcendental meditation. Now that comes from that same way of thinking, that there is a transcendental truth that can be seen by people who meditate and develop the mind through extrasensory perception, or sometimes a word called intuition is being used to refer to that way of seeing things. But there were another kind of philosopher who started saying that definition of truth is not correct. Why? Because that is a truth that no one can really see. No one can know. This is only a guesswork-like thing. And also that this truth, although some people say that the mystics can see through extrasensory perception. But that is also another kind of sense, and it is another kind of perception. What we arrive at is another mental picture of something. And therefore, that is not outside the sensory experience. And so, they rejected that way of thinking. And one thing that happened was that the empirical way of thinking led to an acceptance of what is called probability. The scientists, they are always talking about a probable truth, not the certain truth. So the certainty was what the rationalists developed, but developed or wished to obtain was certainty. But the empiricists said certainty is impossible. We are satisfied with probability. Now, when it came to the empiricists, not the empiricists, the transcendentalists, they were speaking about an absolute truth, a truth that doesn't come from a person's imagination or thinking. So that is the absolute truth that cannot be perceived. But then this other school of thought were called the rationalistic philosophers, or they had other names also, analytical philosophers, the linguistic philosophers, not the rationalistic, I'm sorry, the linguistic philosophers, and also they were called positivists. Now these philosophers, they said it is impossible to arrive at an absolute truth, a truth. And even to talk about truth is not correct. Because any truth that we can talk about will become just a sentence, a statement. A statement comes in the form of a sentence. And these sentences can be analyzed to find out whether it is meaningful or whether it is meaningless. So we can only talk about meaningful sentences, not about truth. So they gave up the search for truth, and they were only talking about meaningful sentences and meaningless sentences. So they analyzed sentences. That's why they were called analytical philosophers. And they were called linguistics because they were using only a sentence, which is the language. And so the search for truth went away. Now truth, they are not interested in truth anymore. They are only talking about statements which are meaningful or meaningless. Then came another kind of philosopher. They were called pragmatists. They started saying, well, the purpose of human thinking is not to discover truth. That's not the purpose of human thinking. The purpose of human thinking is to solve problems. So what we have to do is to solve problems. not to discover truth. So if a person could offer a solution to a problem, we can test it by using that solution and see whether the problem is solved. If the problem is not solved, problem in the world to be solved. One basic problem. All other problems are dependent on this one problem. And that problem is that all human beings are aware that they exist. And they are aware not only of their existence, they are also aware that they are going to die. And because they are aware that they are going to die, there is anxiety, fears, worries about this fact, the emotional disturbance. And this is a problem that needs solution. Really, our whole life, even when we go in search of food, or whether we go in search of jobs, whether we have all kinds of political wars and efforts to solve problems in life, all that is based on this one basic problem, the problem of existence. And they were trying to find a solution. And they found, at least one philosopher like Kierkegaard, he found that it was impossible through human reason to solve this problem. And therefore the only way is to take the leap of faith and to believe in God and the Bible, and then because he was a Christian. But of course there were other existential philosophers who said, no, we can't accept that solution, the leap of faith. Instead of that, we need to go through a different way of thinking. And then, of course, people like Heidegger and Sartre, these people said the only solution is that every human being has to use his own intelligence, become aware of the problem, and solve it. So that solution became the solution. It was not a real solution. The problem was never really solved. Really, when we this is sort of the end of Western philosophy. They couldn't go beyond this. And now, when we look at the teachings of the Buddha, we find that this is the place where Buddha enters the field. And he talks about this problem of existence in what is normally called the Four Noble Truths. He is talking about suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And then he solves the problem. So we can say the Buddhist way of thinking is pragmatic and also existential. But the solution is to point out that belief in existence is a mistake. The solution is seen as giving up the illusion of existence. It is only when that is done that the problem is solved. And that becomes the ultimate truth, not the absolute truth, but the ultimate truth, the final truth, which is the solution to a problem. And so it is pragmatic in that sense, and it is also existential because it deals with that existential problem. And so this is, in short, the Buddhist theory of knowledge, which I just introduced in this way. We can speak about this further as we go along. So thank you. May you all be well and happy.